So in this class, we will only sort of briefly cover um, game design. We'll kind of introduce the topic and discuss it a little bit. But of course, there are other classes available to cover it more thoroughly. But I feel it's important to cover it to some extent in this class, or at least to introduce it. So, as part of a gateway into that, I like to talk a little bit about the history of games um, from the standpoint of understanding uh, where games have come from, and in some sense, we can start to predict where they're going. So, if you look at the games you like to play, and you consider what may have been an influence for those games, you can start to draw a direction, a vector from the games of the past to the games of the present, and you can see where the games of the future might go. Given something like that, right? Where are the new game mechanics? Where are the new ideas? How have they evolved over time? And so from that, you've of course probably as a designer, as a artistic individual or creative individual, probably do have some inspirations uh, from current game designers that you enjoy, that um, like to see their work. And so if you understand who their influences were, you might be able to get a better picture of the kinds of ways, or give you some clues or some motivation for how you might take their work forward, right? So how you might use their influence and find your own space. So that's kind of the idea here. So a lot of the information that I will be referring to here is actually also available, or in a lot of corollary information is available in this movie called Video Games, the movie, which talks about the history and sort of how we came to this point. So I certainly recommend it. It's available on Netflix, and you can check it out and learn more details beyond what I'm telling you here. So there are many places to start a history of games. We could start with Space War or Pong, which are kind of well-known classics. I like to start with Colossal Cave, written by William Crowther. It turns out even recently that there was an article talking about the fact that Crowther's wife was actually the spelunker, the caver, the avid caver who knew about the cave that the Colossal Cave is based on, and Crowther kind of went along with her and learned about the cave, but she was his ex-wife at the time that he created the game, and he did it in order to get closer to his daughter. Um, so there's always some fascinating reasons for these things to exist. Colossal Cave is kind of interesting because it's a fiction, interactive fiction game, an interactive text game, much like Zork, which we see on the screen here, where some very important, sort of very early things came out of it, such as the maze of twisty little passages. You were stuck in a maze of twisty little passages, and also the command word XYZZY, which has stuck with us for many years in a variety of ways. So this was a very influential piece, and I think Zork then became one of the mainstays, and they kind of followed that pattern, right? They in Zork you begin outside of a house, and you open up a mailbox, and then you start to find your way into a cave that's kind of hidden underneath the house, and you wind up in this huge cave system for quite a while. And well, I won't go into spoiler territory, um, but it's a very influential game in terms of both adventure and moving through dungeons, and what became adventure games much later on. It was all done with text, and there were quite a few text adventure games that existed and maintained their popularity through the early 80s, simply because they relied on the player's imagination, much like books do, while still being interactive. Um, they could give you a little bit more than the books could provide in terms of moving through mazes and potentially actually mimicking combat to some degree. You could actually hit or hit monsters and so on. It's hard to overstate the influence that Atari had at the early phases. So where some of the games did work on personal computers and sort of gave you a reason to use your computer outside of uh, writing documents or managing your budget or something with Lotus 123, you could then almost justify the expense by having some additional entertainment on the machine, right? Something else you could do with it, play around with it besides just the work that is obviously not going to take up all the time that you're going to use the machine for. Atari came in. They were big in the arcade space, so they were doling out arcades. In some cases, arcades were actually still kind of sleazy areas that weren't really appropriate for kids, especially early on in the late 70s. This sort of came out of pool halls and had sort of a seedy underbelly, especially in terms of money laundering and things like that, because it turns out coin operating machines are a good way to launder money. Don't recommend that in the future. So Atari was very big, had a lot of influence, and held kind of a main sway over the home console experience for several years until it collapsed, and we'll get to that. But one of the interesting side effects that happened is not just the number of developers that left Atari because they were dissatisfied and created interesting companies such as Activision, but and I think EA may have come out of there as well. But one particular case was so Atari would not allow their developers to put their name in the credits. So even though Atari knew that the developer was important, in fact, that's why they didn't let them put the name in the credits, because their competitors could see who made an interesting game and try to poach that particular developer out. And so Atari didn't want that, or Atari's management. And so the creatives behind it were very dissatisfied. That was one of the reasons that a lot of them wanted to leave, other than the fact they were getting lots of money and lots of people were playing their games because they were Atari games. So Warren Robinett, the creator of a game called Adventure, which is actually the same name as the Colossal Cave, came out, but Adventure is a different sort of game, although somewhat similar. It was a graphical game of sorts. There was a secret room where if the player did the right combination of things, and we won't worry about the details of that, they would get into the room and see the words created by Warren Robinett in that room. And of course, this got through because Atari wasn't really testing games. And so it was a secret, and it was actually the first instance of what's known now as an Easter egg. And so the entire concept of an Easter egg was simply that the developer wanted to put something in that the owner, the management, didn't know about, to sort of hide that extra detail, and sort of rebel, and it's very punk rock in a way because of that. And again, one of the major companies that came out of there was Activision. A group of dissatisfied employees left, formed Activision, and started making some great games. And now they are huge today, where Atari is not so much. And some of that is due to the mismanagement. As an interesting side note, actually, Atari ended up purchasing Infocom, which was the original creator, Activision purchased Infocom later on. They became large enough to purchase Infocom, which was the text adventure giant who started with Zork and then moved on to create many other text adventure games. So the whole idea that video games are only a antisocial kind of pastime has never really been true. It's sort of been true in some ways, and it's a perception that maybe garnered some popularity as video games became more popular, but it's never entirely true. Arcades were structured in a way that you could sort of put your skills on display, right? People would walk by and see it. You'd put a quarter next to the person when you wanted to go play a game against them, or be next in line. You sort of playing next on a game by putting your quarter up by the first person shot, but you were also watching. Crowds would gather. And even with text adventures early on, they went very soon from sort of simple fictional stories, interactive fictional stories, to what are known as MUDs or moos. And so Richard Bartle was a key developer, especially on the first MUD, which was known as a multi-user dungeon. So it's a little bit like taking the game Adventure, or Colossal Cave, or Zork, and so you move north, west, east, and south. You have individual rooms again, much as you did in Zork. You could take things and interact by describing the action. In the MUD case, a lot of what happened more of was the fighting part. So you pick up knives and fight. You might even start to have some D&D elements. You'd have hit points and strength, and you start fighting larger and stronger monsters. And multiple players could play them. In some cases, only one person at a time could be logged in. So you might move through the dungeon, but you'd see the evidence of other players having moved through. You'd see their bodies, or you'd see their equipment, or just the fact that certain monsters had been cleared out of a region. they started to get better at the networking and actually managed to have multiple people on at the same time, so you could actually start to adventure with people. And you got what essentially became the forebear of any modern multiplayer online RPG. As I was growing up, all of us sort of looked forward to the first time that there would ever be a graphical MUD in some sense. We all knew about MUDs, we all knew about a variety of the sort of follow-ons of MUDs, which were still multi-user graphical dungeons, but everyone was interested in what would be the first real one, and of course EverQuest was the first real one. There were actually some before and around EverQuest, but EverQuest was kind of the first really big one. But what's interesting from that time is that moos also existed, and the difference really between a MUD and a moo is that the MUDs were built around the idea that you were going to do kind of the standard fare of combat. You were going to go through and maybe adventure and kill some monsters and get some gold and win the game. And you might interact with people, but the primary purpose was to maybe take your adventure team together to fight the monsters, but you weren't really like role playing. You weren't having lots of conversations. So moos, on the other hand, were really meant for kind of the social bent, the fact that you wanted to get together and chat with people. So they were kind of chat rooms with a lot of extra fantasy flair. So things like Second Life. Second Life is continues to be the thing. But of course, modern chat rooms and Twitter, even in some sense, is kind of a modern day moo. But the fact that people want to interact with each other, want to talk, and maybe have a fantastical environment in which they sort of pretend that they exist and maybe even have a fantasy life where they're still primarily interacting with people, but their interest isn't so much in fighting, it's in playing a role, right? Or just having a conversation at all. And so Richard Bartle understood this very early on. It's fairly old, but he did write it based on his experience with the MUDs. And he discovered that there were what he figured were 4 types of players: the hearts, the spades, the diamonds, and the clubs. That breaks down, it's a mnemonic based on a deck of cards, of course, but the mnemonic works for the kinds of players there are. So the hearts are, of course, the people who like to socialize or like to play support characters, the healers, or they just want to be there to chat. The spades are the ones who explore the game and kind of unlock the mysteries. They really look for the corner cases, the edge cases, so to speak. They try to figure out how the game works. They might even try to push the limits and figure out what they can break. I think of the spades now these days as either the speed runners or the people who try to figure out how to no-hit games. In some cases, although that kind of falls to the diamonds as well. But they're the people who want to kind of not master the game necessarily, but really understand the nooks and the crannies of the game. Whereas the diamonds are the people who want to understand it, like master and understand the game. They actually want to conquer the game completely. So really the people who 100%, speedrunners are probably diamonds as well in some sense, but they're maybe the ones who do it quickly and aggressively, but also without using exploits or cheats or skips. The diamonds would be maybe on that curve, right? But the diamonds and spades probably get along all together because the diamonds want to get really good at the game, and the spades really just want to understand the mechanics behind the game. And then the clubs are probably, you might be guessing, are the griefers, the killers, the people who their joy in games is sort of destroying other people or fighting other people and belittling, killing the noobs, so to speak, right? And so everyone, wants to enjoy the game. And one of the things that Richard calls out in his article is that it might be worth considering making a game that supports everyone in the ways that you can. So a lot of games actually do manage the hunter-killers by having PvP zones and non-PvP zones. Now, it kind of the club folks would still want to get to the non-PvP zones and cause problems there, and they'll always want to kind of do that because that's in their nature. And you might even think, well, it's wrong or incorrect. One might argue that violence at all in a game is wrong, and so we shouldn't have violence in games, and maybe that's true. Or maybe it's an outlet, and maybe it's a way for them to get out this level of aggression in a safer space than it would be if they were to do it elsewhere. I'll leave that as an open-ended question, but it's certainly worth considering whether or not you might actually allow a game to address that. Obviously, it's fairly easy to handle the spades and the diamonds. In some cases, you can handle the hearts by just giving the option for support and communication within your games, especially with other players. But most games kind of gear toward either the spades or the diamonds when they're built these days. Rogue was one of the earliest games that achieved a graphical nature beyond the Colossal Caves and the Zorks and even the Muds. Now, Rogue was a single player game, and the idea behind it is that so this is a slightly more advanced version. I believe this is IBM graphics here. But the idea here is that you are this smiley face moving through the dungeon, and all of the letters, lowercase and capital, are different monsters. So there's 52 different monsters potentially between the 26 lowercase letters and the 26 uppercase letters. These musical notes are scrolls. I think this is a coin here, and this is the staircase that gets you either up or down. And the dungeons would all be randomly generated. So each of these rooms would be constructed randomly. All the monsters would be populated randomly, although they would get harder and harder as you move down through the levels. And your goal was to get to the bottom of level 26 or 25. I think it was 26 because there's same as the number in the alphabet, to get what's known as the Amulet of Yendor in the game, and then hopefully to come all the way back up, right, and succeed and bring it out. And so you might have already guessed this, or you might already know it. This is where the idea of a roguelike comes from. So the original game was called Rogue, and the fact that you would go in and have a random dungeon, and if you died, you died, and that was kind of the end of it, is where this whole notion comes from of a roguelike. And so people have sort of plumbed that depth and come back to it and made random adventures, because this idea was very addictive, right? So you could come into a situation where the game was very unbeatable because it randomly set up a situation that you couldn't beat. And it was meant to be, relatively straightforward in terms of lower level monsters on top and the higher level monsters the deeper you go, so that you have a chance to get stronger. But the scrolls and the potions were all randomly assigned. You wouldn't know what a scroll or a potion did until you used it. If you found an idea, if you tried it, if you decided to just randomly drink a potion, you might be able to figure out what it did, if it healed you or if it made you sick, and then you would know. But you also might die because you did that. And so it's sort of a dangerous game. You never know what things are going to work for you or what things are going to work against you. Every item you pick up might actually be cursed, or it might be have a bonus on it. So it's very exciting, very addictive, and worth replaying a whole bunch. And so obviously that concept as a whole has worked very well. One of the interesting terms that came out of it is what's known as save scumming, and that is because Rogue did only have one save file, and the point was that as you moved through the game, you could of course quit at any time, and it would save your state, and then you'd come back to exactly the state you did. But once you died, that save file was sort of destroyed, right? Or really, it was written to the fact that you died, and then the time you come into play again, it's over. And so some people figured out that they could make a copy of that and kind of save their state sort of more carefully than what Rogue had intended, or the designers of Rogue had intended, and allow them to make progress, right? So that you could try a potion, figure out if it actually was good or bad, and then come back in and reload that save and try again and see. And now you know whether or not that potion was worth having, right? So you could kind of skip, and so it was known as save scumming because you were sort of violating the purpose of the game. But this whole notion of when to save and how you save still it was a debate for quite a long time. I've seen it less nowadays than it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, even, or especially 10 years ago. It's very well known that you should be able to quit a game at almost any moment because games shouldn't own your life, right? So you should be able to walk away from your game and have it save the state, or at least relatively closely save your state. But whether or not you should be able to sort of avoid the anxiety of a certain situation, because the game designer kind of wants you to feel a level of anxiety. They want you to experience that level of anxiety. And if you've had a save 2 to 3 minutes ago, you kind of don't experience any anxiety, right? You don't care. And so some games will do save points, and they'll put a certain amount of space between the save points in order to, build up that anxiety, because you know that there's this block of a window of the game that you have to try to make it through without dying. And yet those save points are kind of a contrary to being able to quit whenever. So if if it's been a while since you hit a save point, you really need to go because you either need to go to the bathroom or you simply need to leave. Then having save points is kind of contradictory to that. It's still kind of an issue today, but usually games allow you to save fairly frequently, and the anticipation is often just built into the game anyway. So, of course, you'll still feel some anxiety, some concern because especially for difficult challenges, regardless of how recently you saved, if it's a difficult challenge, it's kind of nice to know that you can come back and try again, right? So one of the core principles of games is the fundamental theory of games is that you can try again and beat it. This is very strongly in, say, Dark Souls, right? That dying isn't the end, and it's true in Rogue too. Like even though you die, you might get down to level 25 and die. Dying isn't the end. You can still start the game over, but it's a little more anxious when you have to go back through 25 full levels. And then NetHack still exists and still kind of carries forward. It's actually there are people who are still avid NetHack players that exist even today, and it was kind of taking the idea of Rogue and took it to an extreme level. It was openly developed. It's a free game. It's possible to get a hold of it. It is massive. It is complicated. There are, in my experience, if you can think of something you might try to do, somebody thought of it and programmed it in. So there's one situation that I'm aware of is that you can eat creatures in order to gain some of their abilities. But there's a creature that I think if you look at and touch, you turn to stone. I think it's the Chimera, or it might be the Basilisk. But you can manage to eat it if you can wear some gloves and sunglasses so that you can't see it and you can't touch it directly with your skin. But if you're wearing the gloves and then you try to eat the creature, then you actually gain the ability to not be turned into stone anymore. I think you gain some other abilities. So it's kind of a really interesting thing in terms of really complicated game mechanics and the way they interact with each other, and the fact that they've managed to create these really complicated ideas in a massive game, all with letters and symbols, much as you see here. Same kind of concept. This is actually a character now, the @ symbol, and I think that was the original Rogue. I used an @ symbol. This is the fancy graphics right here. This is actually the old school graphics for NetHack and for Rogue as well. Although NetHack kind of took it to another level, so there's quite a bit more going on here.
So I have a challenging time with Richard Garriott because there's a lot of things that I sort of find awkward about his success, and it seems like he, in a large part, got very lucky in what he did, but he's also seems like a very nice person and actually pretty great for game development in general. So where he got lucky, he created this game called Kelebeth when he was fairly young, I think still in high school or maybe early 20s. It was essentially, it's shown here in the lower right, it became sort of a very graphical Rogue. Now, I don't know that Rogue was necessarily an inspiration. He was probably inspired by D&D. Took that to heart in terms of building this maze and this dungeon that you could fight through. And so it's in many ways sort of an obvious extension. You do some graphics of some kind, but he did certainly figure out how to get those graphics going, to his credit. And he actually came up with an overworld which in Kelebeth didn't look like the image to the upper right, but was very similar in sort of the way it worked. It was actually line art in Kelebeth, but then Ultima followed the same pattern. Essentially, Ultima was a follow-on to Kelebeth that started the Ultima series, which then is what Richard Garriott is known for most. Lord British, a character that he sort of, I think his friends referred to him as because he sort of spoke in Elizabethan English, is a character that he's kept with him. It's a little bit awkward. It seems very childish in many ways, but it carries forward. And so those are some of the things that are awkward. The other one that is somewhat awkward with Ultima is that he went for a moral system, a system of morality, which ended up feeling somewhat ham-fisted in its approach. It was an interesting take on the attempt, and games now have sort of taken that further. Games like Mass Effect and Dragon Age especially, and many others that sort of allow you to play a good and bad character, and your decisions have consequences in those ways in terms of the gameplay. Ultima was maybe the first example of doing that, but it was very, very strong. So um, he had a very strict code of right and wrong, and you lost horribly if you did wrong. In fact, as I understand it, in one of the Ultima games, maybe Ultima 6, you couldn't complete the game if you happened to steal from somebody at some point. And essentially, you would be locked out of the final battle. You'd be unable to actually attain the final victory. And you wouldn't really know. And so you simply needed to know right from wrong and not to steal, even though stealing was a, a thing that you could pull off and could be a viable strategy maybe in some cases. And so that's where it feels more ham-fisted and just kind of like somebody scolding you to be right rather than maybe encouraging you to be right or do something with a little more nuance. So I give him props for developing that, but in many cases too, like he sort of created the obvious extension of Dungeons and Dragons and roguelites and all that into a graphical frame that was very good and lucky timing, and a lot of his success came from that.
So Roberta Williams was one of the, I think, co-founders of Sierra Games. She and her husband built Sierra Games or Sierra Online, and they did employ other developers, but Roberta was kind of the primary source of a lot of their games. And they started with a game called Mystery House, which actually, so as you see here, you're in front of a yard of a large abandoned Victoria house, very similar to Zork. And so what they did there was really follow, rather than the kind of the the mud and dungeon and the sort of fighting and rogue kind of sense of graphical adventure, they went with more of the adventure side of Zork, where you want to pick things up and figure out where the keys were and unlock it. So it was more of a interactive fiction with graphics than maybe more combat oriented, right? So King's Quest was really one of the bigger ones in terms of its success, and it had many follow-ons. I think 7 or 8 now. There's even one that came out a few years ago, a sort of remake of the whole King's Quest series, and it was fairly foundational early on. It did have some game design flaws as well. So one of the rules of thumb, so to speak, is that you really shouldn't leave outside knowledge to games. So this is something that we now sort of know about the way game design should work. But back then, some of the clues and some of the puzzles that would be solved were related to well-known either nursery rhymes or fables. So I think you had to know to name a character Rumpelstiltskin, but there was nothing in the game that told you about that. You kind of had to know that a character was at a weaving wheel and that it probably made sense that he was Rumpelstiltskin, and you had to guess that name. And so things like that, where it's taking outside the game knowledge from outside the game, is sort of unfair, right? And takes you outside the game itself. It doesn't really exist within the game world, and so in a certain way, it's kind of doesn't make as much sense. But there were many games that followed this kind of pattern. So this was certainly an early one. You have a single room, again, same kind of concept. You have a single room, you move from left to right in the room. Sometimes you can't move through, you get passages, and you could pick up items in the space, but you actually had to move your little dude here to that item and pick it up. But you'd still type in to say pick up item and use key on door and things like that. The King's Quest series is also known for having being part of the save controversy. So it was possible to save the game anywhere at any time with King's Quest, and it was important because you could die very easily in very arbitrary ways. In some cases, I remember a staircase where it was very easy to sort of walk off the edge because the controls were hard. Being, I think, 9 years old at the time, I can assure you that I did not lose the fear or the tension due to the fact that I had saved very recently. I still somehow had to get to the top of that staircase. And so even though I could save at the bottom and started to become very aggressive at saving, and this has saved me, so I learned the lesson that you should save often, save early and save often, and I've never really lost a paper because my computer crashed, and I've never really had that kind of issue happen because I'm always saving my documents every few minutes. And it's partially because of King's Quest that I have this anxiety about saving frequently and maybe multiple times, even though I only needed to really save once to make sure that it really did save. So Mule was a really interesting game that came out, but it was one of the first sort of management tycoon-like games where you actually owned some property, and the mule was used to transfer your ore or whatever it was you were mining around, and by getting more, you could build more, and so on. And there's even a feature of microeconomics, and it's actually been redone in a modern game called Off-World Trading Company, where they attribute a lot of their influence to Mule. So this takes place on, I think it's Mars or the Moon, and your idea is to take over, get plots of land, and try to mine the Moon or Mars or whatever for resources. But they do use a ferrying type of device that's very similar to the Mule, and there's influence from there. And also, Danielle Bunton herself is a very interesting figure. She is a trans woman who developed games and developed a very popular game very early on. And she's kind of the first instance of where games have allowed people at the boundaries, so to speak, or the underrepresented people to express themselves. And that continues today. It continues to be a fight today, especially. But it's built into the genetics of games. This is at this point a very old game, and yet very early on we had a trans woman creating a game like this. And so the fight will, I suppose, continue because politics is what it is. But it's certainly been the case, and of course, with a variety of games, people have always been able to, make their hair blue or purple or green, or they've been able to represent themselves as female or male at any point when they've wanted to in the history of games. It's always been kind of that option to some degree, and of course, that sort of decision and that sort of agency about your own life, given what you can do with a character, is very interesting and poignant, and one of the key features, I think, of identity representation in games. So the first death of games happened with Atari. In particular, this game, E.T., was attributed with a lot of what is considered the failure of games, of the games market, and it was really because of an exploitation. So E.T. is just a symptom, I think. It's not really the cause, or it's at least correlated, but not really it's a correlation problem, not a causation problem. But E.T. was a case where they essentially created and tried to sell more cartridges of E.T. than there were Atari systems sold or owned by any person in the world. Right? So they made just far too many. And it was, an aggressive hope, and they made the poor developer who made Atari, they gave him only a few weeks to do it, to try to time it to the Christmas season, and it was very exploitative, very cynical in the way they did it. And of course, he ended up making a terrible game out of it. He is also the person who made Yar's Revenge, which is considered one of the greatest games. But anyway, so there were some poor choices made, and the quality of games became less and less because it was so exploitative. And we see this kind of thing happening again now, where Atari was opening the floodgates and not really caring about the quality, and a lot of other companies are opening up the floodgates and not necessarily caring about the quality. But of course, with digital releases, there's less of an incentive because we don't care how many cartridges are sold. There's no more cartridges involved, right? So people just have to download the games. But it does make it harder to find good games. The cream still rises to the top in some sense, but it feels harder to make a decision with a limited amount of money on a given game because you can't trust the quality. There's no sort of gatekeeper to help you ferret it out. Now, it does open the floodgates a little bit and makes it possible for people to make the games. But we did have a crash because the floodgates were open. So historically, at least, it hasn't been a good idea. Now, there is one company who did actually maintain quality and kind of came through that crash period unscathed, and that was Nintendo. So the Nintendo Entertainment System came out, I think, shortly after Atari crashed, or around the same time, with their system. So they're a very old company. They were a games company, but they were, I think it was a card game company at the time. But the details don't matter too much. We know them now as the Nintendo Entertainment System, the SNES, and so on. But one of the early games they made was a Mario game. They did make some arcade games as well. But I think what's interesting about Nintendo especially, and Shigeru Miyamoto in particular as a designer is that not so much that they made it through the crisis or whatever, or even that they have fairly good quality control, but it's that they sort of became the Disney of video games. That they focused on characters that you know about, right? So when you go to Disneyland, when you're involved with Disney in some way, or you go to be entertained by Disney, there's always sort of the open-ended question of when are we going to get to see Mickey, right? When am I going to get to see Mickey? Am I going to get to take a picture of Mickey? If I go see a show of some kind, is Mickey going to make an appearance? And everyone gets really excited when Mickey shows up for some period of time, or when he's a character walking around the street and he gets mauled by or mobbed by groups of people who want to get a picture with him because he finally showed up on Main Street or whatever in a certain costume. And he shows up, of course, very frequently in Disneyland for real, but there's a delay, right? And so everyone's looking forward to it. And it's one of those things that's sort of artificial scarcity, the excitement of when you get to see Mickey. And exactly the same thing happens every time Nintendo releases a new console. It's not, we're tired of seeing Mario, we're tired of yet another Mario sequel. It's when do we get to see Mario? And when do we get to see Zelda in this iteration? When do we get to see Donkey Kong again? So it's not so much with the design that we get tired or we get fatigued by yet another sequel. We want to see these characters again. We want to know how they are now. We want to keep going with them. And it's genius, and it's one of the things that I think keeps Nintendo going, is the fact that they created these characters that are icons, and they own that. We have some other icons. Tomb Raider, Lara Croft is kind of an icon. Nathan Drake is kind of an icon. But we'd really expect to only see Mario, right? We'll see Lara Croft maybe in another Tomb Raider, and that's cool. But she doesn't quite have the same thing as a Zelda or a Link or a Donkey Kong or a Mario, right? There's no characters that quite follow that level. So it's very something to consider as you consider your own design. Can you come up with a character, regardless of gameplay, because all these characters have been in a wide variety of different gameplay, where the character itself is so important. Can you compete with Disney on that level? It might be hard. I'm sorry, Disney. Can you compete with Nintendo or Disney on that level in your own design? So one of my personal favorite follow-ons in the world of rogue-like follow-ons or NetHack or whatever you call it are Kraz and ZZT, which are very similar games. And I think in this case, Kraz came first. As Kraz was so again, we're using the IBM graphics, and you move through the space, and you can fight the characters. Except that the goal here now is, or you fight the monsters or whatever. But the goal here is rather than moving into the monster, it's actually free time, and so you have to use twitch mechanics. You actually have to shoot and avoid and move through the space, and be kind of smart about it and be skilled rather than rogue and NetHack. You time only moved forward when you moved, and so you could pause and try to figure out what you wanted to do about a monster that was coming for you. Every time you moved, they probably moved closer to you, but you could pause and think about it. Whereas in Kraz and ZZT, the monsters came at you. And so Scott Miller went on to form, I think this ZZT became the formation of Apogee, and then later 3D Realms, which became Duke Nukem, the house for Duke Nukem. Tim Sweeney, of course, built Epic from his ZZT foundation. And of course, now we know Epic as what we're working on now with Unreal. So anyway, both of these games, I believe, had level editors. You can still actually create levels for them. And of course, we see that now today as also some lifeblood in terms of, the Unreal Engine in some sense is a massive level editor that was built out of the Unreal game and became more and more of an engine that people could use.
So while it's certain that LucasArts came after Sierra, it's hard to pick apart where the influences lie. I think it's pretty evident that LucasArts kind of took what Sierra was doing and took it further, right? So they focused primarily on cinematics, on the artistic side of things, the narrative, and made that kind of the forefront. And so they did a lot of innovation in terms of, you see with Monkey Island here, sort of non-traditional views. You get a lot of art where it was in a lot of artwork in sort of the foreground of the scene to let you feel like you're looking into an enclosed room. And they also, started with the graphical verbs. So rather than having sort of the hunt the verb kind of thing that you would have that came from text adventures and directly into the Sierra games, where you're trying to guess, do I want to take this? Can I use the word open? Can I use the word unlock? You know that those words were already there, and so you just click. And really, what you're interested in is just figuring out, what the puzzle is, rather than just trying to guess at what word you need to type in to do the thing you want to do. And so their focus was a lot more on just the interesting puzzles and, of course, the narrative part. And to that end, one of the big innovations that LucasArts was really heavy on was death is not an option in some sense. So rather than in King's Quest you have death and your character dies and it's terrible and you have to reload the game. If you die, so to speak, or if you fail some kind of like challenging thing in a LucasArts game, you don't die. So, for instance, in the game Full Throttle, you'd have some like bicycle scenes where you could potentially crash your vehicle. So rather than your character dying in Full Throttle, he falls off the bike and he has to go and wheel it and get back up. And it certainly sets you back, but it doesn't ruin the story in the sense that it doesn't say that the hero died, right? Which is something that they thought didn't really fit in with the kind of narrative that they were going for. Rather, failing made sense within the story in some sense that the hero could fail potentially and then sort of get back on his bike and keep going. And so that carried through in almost all of their games. And without really losing the challenge was an interesting innovation and sort of a focus on story. So one of the things that just really comes out of the LucasArts period is the transition from adventure games as being sort of this, game-like thing to more of a mix-up between, say, movies and cinema and art and storytelling, as well as they're still keeping kind of the puzzle structure and the notion of needing to solve puzzles to get through the game. If we carry forward the concept coming out of Mule of management and resource control and all these kinds of things, then one of the big evolutions of that that moves forward is Sid Meier's games. So Civilization still exists. It still carries forward. I don't know that Sid Meier's is necessarily directly involved in that anymore, but certainly I don't have to speak to it as though it's in the past. It's a current game, and so Civilization was, an attempt to turn the entire Earth, the entire history of the Earth, into a management game. One of the really interesting innovations here, one of the things that comes out of especially the way Sid Meier's does things, and the fact that he's doing kind of simulations of resource management and things like that, is that they end up being sort of subversively educational. So because of the Civilopedia in Civilization, you could learn quite a bit about, the wonders of the ancient world, innovations like the granary and horses. But the important thing actually isn't so much that you learn the concept of what a granary is. In Civilization, it becomes necessary to build a granary in order to store your food, in order to have your civilization grow more aggressively. Or even better, the innovation of taming horses and using them to either help plow fields or move behind chariots or simply to become part of your army as a cavalry. You actually feel the impact of these kinds of things in your game. And so you understand at almost more of a visceral level the importance of the granary, or the importance of the establishment of pottery, or the importance of taming horses. And so that's the interesting subversive part, and it's something that hasn't been fully explored in such a popular way. There's certainly games that exist that kind of do this, and people will be tasked with playing those games, but people don't necessarily choose to do that. And yet many people who've played Civilization do actually understand a lot about sort of global world history simply by virtue of playing the game. Now, they don't understand the specifics, of course, because the world is different, the way it plays out is different, but they can kind of understand the way those things impacted it. And of course, even with the world wonders, I can say that I'm more familiar with the Hanging Gardens and the pyramids and the Great Library and things like that simply because of Civilization, and otherwise I probably wouldn't know any of those things off the top of my head. So Sid Meier's really focused on, or really enjoyed making games around simulation of mechanics, resources, and so on, management kind of games. And so Railroad Tycoon is another one of those where it's really just the distribution of goods back and forth and the excitement of kind of managing your trains and managing the supply and demand that's necessary there. And these games, I don't know that Railroad Tycoon exists as a necessarily a Sid Meier's game either, or definitely not in the same sort of evolution as Civilization 6 that currently exists as Civilization 6. There are a variety of Transport Tycoon and Railroad Tycoon type games that reuse that name. There's actually, in fact, a variety of tycoon games that use that name in general to imply that you are managing resources and capitalism and all that as a game. Things like Game Dev Tycoon and Hotel Tycoon and so on. But Railroad Tycoon was certainly one of the earliest, and so that concept of having to manage railroads and migrate goods back and forth still exists, and it's been carried forward as well. And then an interesting one with the Pirates game. It turns out that that one was a little bit of a diversion in this case, that it was actually more of a simulation of being a pirate, that you're traveling from port to port. I believe, I don't know if it was one of the early ones or the later ones that actually did have sword fighting on the deck, so it's maybe a little bit less of a management kind of game. But in this case, it's actually following sort of a privateer. I'm out on the open seas. I have my boat. I can choose to smuggle goods from here over to there and get some money out of that sort of exciting smuggling. I can go and rob people of it. And that privateer concept will come back in space because boats and spaceships have a lot of similarities in terms of especially the kind of fantastical gameplay that you can do with them. But what's also interesting is that one of the modern games with Assassin's Creed, the Assassin's Creed Black Flag, it turns out one of the most popular versions of Assassin's Creed over the last several years, being Black Flag, kind of followed that same pattern where you could get a boat and you could go from port to port and you could have adventures and you could have sort of the freedom of being able to sail the seas. There was probably some influence there. Whether or not there was influence there, certainly they could have learned the fact that people enjoyed playing as pirates and having that kind of availability, and it worked really well, especially in that context. And of course, because of the success in the modern world or the modern day Assassin's Creed game, now we see many more games actually following that pattern of allowing you to own a boat and go travel from port to port. So staying within the sort of management space, Will Wright, one of my favorite designers, really lets you manage artificial intelligence. So rather than managing a simulation of, say, logistics or capitalism, I think the primary focus or what you see different in what Will Wright's games do versus what Sid Meier's games do is Sid Meier's games has rules, certainly, and they sort of evoke the idea that maybe you do have a civilization with people who are revolting or not revolting, or happy with you or not happy with you. But with Will Wright, you actually feel like you're managing a population in SimCity of people who are trying to live in your city. So you feel much more like a mayor who's actually trying to manage the traffic, the happiness of the citizens. The citizens, feelings are very important. That certainly came through in other tycoon games, but Will Wright was kind of on the forefront of really using AI as a play space. And so you've got these things that feel like real agents that you're playing with. And of course, if we take that to the next step, then we get to The Sims, which is much more zoomed in, and really a lot of similar concepts in terms of we have AI people, and now what we're doing is just managing a household. So rather than a city, rather than managing a full city of many thousands of people, we're managing a household of maybe 5 people. And so the AI is much more complicated, much more interesting and complex, and has desires and relationships, interrelationships, and broken relationships. And what's kind of fascinating about that game in particular is that it was actually very hard for him to convince anyone to make it. Pretty much the only reason that he was allowed to make it was because he was kind of the superstar of Maxis at the time. Yeah, so in a certain sense, Will Wright was Maxis at the time, and so he had a lot of say in terms of what the company should make, but he still had to pick a fight in order to get it made. And that's because people saw The Sims as a virtual dollhouse, and at this time, this particular time period, marketing was especially focused on games are for boys, right? And games are not for girls. And so there's no reason that we should make a game like this because girls don't play games, boys play games. It wasn't ever true. Girls were always playing games, but the marketing certainly decided to pick that girls should stop playing games, and so they started selling the information that way. It turns out that marketing people tend to not know anything other than how to sell a basic product, and especially in the case of the creative industry, they always get it wrong. And the Sims is probably one of the worst cases of getting it wrong because Sims ended up going from being a game that they didn't want to make because they figured it was a game for girls and wouldn't sell, to being the number one selling game ever until Minecraft came along. So because Sims was kind of open ended, because you could construct a life, you could sort of play with it. You got to be player as creator. You got to sort of decide how things moved simply by sort of playing with the AI, right? You're kind of interacting with the AI, and the AI is interacting with you and what you do to the house. You also get to design the house. You do get to play out like drama stories. You get to sort of evolve the characters in certain ways, try to establish relationships and whatnot. It actually, didn't have very much of a game structure in it in terms of the way many people played. They simply, played with a dollhouse and intelligent characters within that dollhouse, and both men and women, boys and girls, loved that game. And so it ended up being one of the best-selling games of all time because the notion that it's a girls' game or a boys' game or a pink or blue game is very stupid. And has never been true and shouldn't have ever been true and was sold terribly. So that's maybe one of the important lessons there. That and there hasn't been very many AI-driven games in the same way. Will Wright has certainly worked in this space and continues to work in this space, but we're still kind of looking for the next big thing. Spore was not quite as exciting as it could have been. So with Chris Roberts, we get Star Wars as a video game, and really that Wing Commander is a different story, but it had a lot of similarities. Had the hero with 1,000 faces and the hero's journey kind of thing happen again. In fact, Mark Hamill ended up being one of the voices in the game as well later on when they started adding voices. But the idea was to really capture the spirit of being a starfighter pilot and saving the universe from alien hordes. And this was certainly that fantasy that being captured. What's kind of cool about what happened here is you'll notice that there's a large portion of the screen is covered by the spaceship, and really the only piece that we see is the viewport, right, the window, where much of anything is happening. And so we get a kind of early take on 3D games simply because space is easy to render. It's mostly black, right, or navy if you're doing a good job of not choosing a black color. And the spaceships can be low poly, and you see, a reasonable level of sort of 3D rendering there, but of course it's blocky and doesn't look as good as maybe modern games do with rendering, especially with the recent releases of space games. But they could save a lot by only needing to render those spaceships in 3D and not much else, and certainly not the cockpit, and the cockpit is still a 2D graphic, which does update, does animate, but uses sprites. And so even the hand in front will move, but it's still a sprite that's rendered and choosing certain sprite patterns rather than trying to do a full 3D render, which would be difficult to do for large scale. And so it was a great cheat, and continues to be an effective one in some cases to actually pull off that level. But the real innovation here, and kind of the thing that carried forward, was the fact that people did want to be a starfighter pilot, and so following that fantasy, exploring that fantasy, really made the game stand out. Figuring out that trick to make it possible to render was kind of the key. There were certainly games that came in before it didn't feel as fully 3D as this one. And of course, there's a game that came shortly after, sometime after, called Wing Commander Privateer, which really set up the idea of a freelancer sort of mercenary type gameplay, where rather than being sort of a character with a narrative plot that you're kind of following, now you're opened up to it, and you can go and you kind of play, rather than Luke Skywalker, you're more the Han Solo, right? You go from port to port, you're smuggler, you meet up with people, you take odd jobs here and there, and follow that kind of a pattern. And that one has been, starting with Sid Meier's with the Pirates games and moving into space. That game has certainly been made over and over again since, in many, many ways, and many space games, modern space games, still follow that pattern where Things like Elite Dangerous and even Eve Online has a bit of that as well, where you can go and smuggle and you exist kind of in a world. Yeah, incidentally, games like American Truck Simulator actually follow that same pattern as well. Where now you're a semi truck driver, but you still follow the same pattern of picking up goods from here and there. You're not necessarily smuggling, but you're earning money, buying better trucks, improving your ships, or improving your guns or whatever. In the case of the starships, not necessarily the semi truck again, and getting to do more of it. And it's a tight little game loop, and one that certainly continues to be popular. I should also note that Chris Roberts continues to work these days in what was known as the most funded crowdfunding game ever, called Star Citizen. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer to say that it was crowdfunded. It certainly was funded originally, much like Kickstarter or any of those kinds of games. But beyond that, people have been playing essentially an early release version of the game rather than, say, a crowdfunding necessarily. And so what's happening is that people are sort of pre-purchasing spaceships to fly around. It's meant to be an open world, a massively multiplayer kind of game where you're flying everyone around in space and you're doing the whole privateer kind of thing, much like EVE Online. But of course, you can actually fly in your spaceship like you would with a Chris Roberts game. I think you can potentially walk around on space stations as well as you might do with like No Man's Sky, which is certainly influenced by Chris Roberts. But given the fact that people are essentially paying for things in the early release game, it's no longer necessarily a crowdfunding the same way. It's really just purchasing, and so it's a very successful game that has yet to be properly released in any form. But an interesting sort of development in the new and exciting world of crowdfunding that may have also just gone away entirely at this point. So where Chris Roberts was maybe the introduction of some levels of 3D or some certainly early 3D, the real kind of critical point for the development of video games was Doom. There were kind of two aspects of that. One was the fact that it was something that felt like a real 3D game where you were participating. They really innovated on this whole concept of the first-person shooter, invented that entire spectrum, but then also essentially pushed the technology far enough that was what people saw as games from that point on, and kept pushing it with Quake and so on. So certainly this is id Software. John Carmack and John Romero are considered kind of the forefathers of the company. There were others like Tom Hall and some other folks that were involved early on, and Michael Brash came later. He was actually instrumental in the development of Quake, but he was actually instrumental in a lot of articles that he was writing early on that John Carmack was reading and became a fan of while developing Doom. So the company started with the idea of just trying to make a 2D platform game similar to Mario, and their first innovation actually was how to get scrolling to work. So in this class, we've seen and discussed the way scrolling works with tiles and dirty rectangles, and it turns out that it was very expensive to actually try to draw all those triangles as you're moving the screen forward, especially pixel by pixel. You could maybe swap out all of the tiles and move one tile at a time, but that would jump you forward by 32 pixels rather than 1 pixel. And so Carmack figured out a pretty good way of copying the memory internal to the video card that made it possible to do 2D games like Mario, except on a PC, whereas the Mario games, the Nintendo could actually use specialized hardware for that. So to do it in PC was very good because the distribution was easier. They could actually send out discs and so on and shareware. And so they made a game called Commander Keen, and that kind of put them on the map. But it wasn't until they built Wolfenstein and then later really pushed the envelope with Doom that people saw the future of gaming, and this kind of and so much so that became the exclusive way that games were. Almost exclusively beyond that point. Almost all games that came out, all the big budget games, were first-person shooter games. So in Wolfenstein, the innovation was simply to just figure out how to turn a 2D space into something that looked 3D. In Doom, they took it further and it actually started to feel 3D. You technically were still in a 2D space, but it felt a lot more 3D. It had multiple platforms, multiple levels and floors that you can move through. And yet all of this without graphics cards and on a PC with the the limits that you have. The other innovation that they had was to figure out how to make it work in network style. And so this was kind of the two big pieces that then defined video games for quite a long time, and continue to define the way video games are played. That you have a first-person shooter where you can shoot people, and those people can be someone else on the network. And so that's really fundamental, and drove the industry, drove a lot of technology, and also curbed innovation for quite a while, because people were only making just realistic war shooters, or maybe just trying to improve the graphics without ever really innovating beyond the notion of point and shoot. So if you think about the gameplay, the gameplay is simply point and shoot, and be faster and quicker at moving your mouse and clicking your mouse button than somebody else is. So somewhat coincidentally or ironically, the innovation that did occur, was minimal, but did exist. So these two guys come back. We saw them previously with the Craws and the ZZT, and now they're back making follow-ons to Doom. In this case, in the top we have Scott Miller working on Duke Nukem, which turned into 3D Realms or turned from Apogee to 3D Realms. And the one of the main innovations there was to have the character speaking with a sort of Bruce Campbell, Ash in the Evil Dead type voice. In fact, I think they got sued for that at one point. And then we have Unreal, which was really the one-to-one comparison with Quake for many years. So as I mentioned before, or I may have mentioned before, Tim Sweeney is pretty good at picking a fight. He's currently picking a fight with Apple and Epic and all that. And he was really good at picking a fight with Steam. He's really good at picking a fight with id Software to kind of be competitive. I say that with some jest, because while he's very competitive, very good at picking sort of a capitalist fight, it's not necessarily personal, right? In fact, he actually gave the Lifetime Achievement Award to John Carmack a few years ago at GDC. So he's willing to sort of see his competitors as somebody that he wants to pick a battle with, but not necessarily like fight in person in that regard. But he's certainly very good at kind of picking these battles. Now what's funny is I mentioned that with the innovation of Doom, we did really get kind of this channel effect, this sort of a railroad of games that just simply follow this pattern of first-person shooter and network games. And so Unreal, one of the reasons that we're still using the Unreal Engine is simply for that fact that Tim Sweeney kind of took the original Unreal that he built to compete with Quake, and now we're using it to develop games these days. And maybe one of the things that he did better than id Software did in some ways is figure out how to license his software in a more global way. And part of that was the fact that Unity came out and kind of figured out how to capture a lot of that market, and Unreal wanted some of that market, and so they followed suit in that direction rather than one-off copies. So these two games still exist in certain forms. Duke Nukem Forever was a game that actually did literally take almost forever to come out, or at least it felt like forever. 3D Realms doesn't really exist, but certainly Epic Games does exist, and obviously because that's what our whole class is built around this semester. So continuing with the theme of sort of the attempt to innovate something with the Doom engine. So the original Half-Life was actually built on a heavily modified version of Quake, but their emphasis was actually to innovate in terms of story. So they wanted to have actual characters in there that you might care about. They wanted to have a story that meant more than just shoot everyone you see in the face. There's scientists in there that you're trying to protect, and there's like this whole backstory of a science experiment gone wrong, and a lot of characters like the agent, the secret agent man, that continue to be sort of characters that are well known, and they explored the concepts of alien infestation and so on, that are in even games like Last of Us now, that sort of carry a backstory to sort of the larger picture story that's happening. But the interesting point there is that even Half-Life, in its original form, was just a Doom mod or a Quake mod. It wasn't really a fully innovative game in many senses in terms of it was still point and click and all that, but you at least were able to in many of the ways that the LucasArts games did, get some innovation in terms of the kinds of story that were trying to be told with that, and the way those stories were told. And of course, for Valve, it worked out really well for them. It turned out that making Steam was actually the biggest winner for them. And maybe Half-Life 2 helped, but certainly that helped springboard Steam, and that's really where a lot of their money comes from, their ability to kind of stay afloat from. So then we enter into kind of a dark period of game development. Almost the first decade of the 2000s had a lot of, just iteration after iteration. Most of the big games that were being made, the ones that were easy to find, the ones that you could find on the shelves, because digital distribution wasn't really a thing, were a sequel to the game last year that it looked slightly more realistic, and so a slightly better way of killing people, and more effective visualization of killing people, and guts are flying or blood is flying, a better blood splatter and all that. There were certainly some innovations here and there, things like Rock Band came out around this time, and so on. And so there are some things that were happening, but a lot of the main focus, a lot of the main driver, and a lot of the budget and investment were all happening in the space of who was making the next first-person shooter. So Call of Duty and Battlefield and all of those were all kind of competing at this time in this space to just take the technology forward. In some ways, this was very good because the technology did move forward. We got better and better graphics cards simply to make better rendering. They were able to sell and justify the sale of those graphics cards. And this was really kind of a marketing win because games, you no longer had games like Sims where whether or not it was meant for girls or not, we had games that were now built around built only for people that liked to sort of experience their aggression viscerally, and especially to shoot their friends and get on network games and shoot other people and get their aggression out, which it has both good and bad aspects to it, but maybe the bad aspect in this case was it was kind of the only option for many years, or one of the main and few options that you had in terms of what kinds of gameplay you could play. And so that's where in terms of the design, I speak of this as the sort of a dark history in the development of video games. So then we get the light at the end of the tunnel coming in the next decade. So 2010 and on, and 2012 was kind of the big year for indie games. Indie games came in with all of this enhanced technology and then threw us back to all the way back to, say, Commander Keen or Mario in terms of the gameplay. And so even though we're now 20 to 30 years ahead of those games in terms of technology, we're coming back and exploring where that gameplay could have gone. And so the expansion that we're seeing isn't necessarily technological in either Cave Story or in Braid, but really what are the new kinds of gameplay that we can explore with a platformer that isn't just point and shoot again, right? And so Cave Story did have a lot of point and shoot, but there's a lot of adventure aspects and collecting things and sort of multi-levels and all over the place, a huge world, almost like an open world platformer. Braid was really innovative in terms of just the concept of time and being able to rewind time or move time left and right, and the way space works, and even to the point that Braid actually had a really clever sort of ending which works both forward and backward in time and tells two completely different stories and shows some really interesting narration in terms of both intermixing gameplay with narration in that final level. I won't spoil that in this lecture, but I certainly encourage you, if you've never played it, to get to that final level or at least look at a playthrough and see what's happening there. Now, of course, beyond this, we see many platformers. If you look at the number of platformer, especially indie and puzzle games that are released for Steam, we've got kind of a glut these days of platformers, and people are getting a little sick of it because they're somewhat easier to make, and of course the innovations are certainly possible, and there are other things to explore. But we're starting to at least see now that especially that the engines like Unreal and Unity are making 3D so much easier, that we are seeing people start to explore the other ways that you can work in 3D as well as 2D and the other kinds of gameplay. One of the main points of looking at this is to encourage you to explore all of the possibilities for gameplay, whether 3D or 2D, platformer, puzzle, or even just moving beyond and figuring out what other kinds of gameplay there could be. So if we follow the train of Minecraft, then it's kind of the successor to Sims in many ways, and especially in terms of its popularity and the fact that the player is creator and is actually creating the world that they're living in and interacting with. You are not really interacting with AIs in Minecraft in anywhere near the way you would with Sims. And again, there's not really games that are kind of going in that space as yet. But what we find is, we do have multiplayer, but now we have, rather than multiplayer point and shoot each other in the face, we have multiplayer collaboration and multiplayer collaborative creativity, where we have multiple people in the space trying to survive the world in some cases, or maybe not even bothering with surviving the world and just building things together or showing them off to each other. And then we also get mods that do bring in different kinds of gameplay as well, like bed wars and egg wars, and I can't remember what other variations there are. So there have actually been some explorations in 3D space because of Minecraft, simply with the mod space that's happened there. And so it's become kind of an interesting follow-on, and surprisingly, it has become not only a genre, but kind of a force of nature within games. It continues today. It was first, I think Notch started building it somewhere in the early 2000s, so like 2008 or 7 or something. It really started entering public consciousness around 2012, similar to the same year that we got Braid and Cave Story and the indie explosion. But it's really taken off since then, and it doesn't appear to be slowing down. So it's a game with a lot of longevity to it. Whereas Braid and Cave Story may have disappeared from the public consciousness, everybody continues to know and download and buy new copies of Minecraft, which is remarkable. So if you have not heard of how Minecraft came to be, there was a game called Infiniminer that came out a bit before, and it was developed by the guy who has the same developer who did Space Chem and a few other games. So he's kind of in the world of just kind of mechanisms and putting mechanisms to games and how you play with them. And that was kind of his focus for Infiniminer. He's now well known as being the guy that sort of could have made $2 billion if he continued with his game and made it into Minecraft, but of course he wasn't really thinking in that way. Surprisingly, he's still made a number of games, and they're very interesting and actually unique gameplay in terms of their sort of puzzle and mechanical nature. So there's a lot of inspiration from Infiniminer. There's also an inspiration from a game called Dwarf Fortress for Minecraft, which is a game that involves simulation of dwarves. It takes a lot of cues from the tycoon game Civilization, and especially Will Wright kind of games where you do actually have AI as characters. So it's got a lot of like semi-intelligent character. The dwarves are all semi-intelligent and can live in a world, but they go further with the ability to have disease and so on. And if you look at this, you start to see a lot of similarity to things that we've already talked about. So you could probably at this point trace the lineage of Dwarf Fortress all the way back to, say, Croz or ZZT, or even back as far as NetHack and Rogue, especially NetHack in terms of a lot of the ways that NetHack sort of allowed anything to happen. Dwarf Fortress also allows anything to happen, and if you can actually interpret the screen, which is admittedly hard to do if you're not an intense gamer, then there's a lot to unpack in terms of story and interacting with the AI character. So while I said that almost no one is doing the kind of things that Will Wright was doing in terms of playing with AI, that's not true in terms of Dwarf Fortress. It's not necessarily a popular game. It's very hard to penetrate as a normal person, or as a an entry level person to figure out the game, to understand it. But if you spend enough time to learn it and find out what's there, then you find a very deep and rich simulation, both in terms of the ability to modify the world and interact with the world, but also the AI that are existing in the world, the physics that are described by the world in terms of water and collapsing walls and things like that. All of which are things that Minecraft had borrowed from, but turned into 3D and focused primarily on that without really having much in the way of, say, dwarves and societies and so on. So we see an example here now of a modern game that continues to be modern, that has followed an evolution all the way back to almost the very beginning, where we could trace back to even cave story and so on. The generational flow of the ideas and the way they were captured and evolved and brought into the modern space. And so I encourage you to look at this as an opportunity to both mine the past, because a lot of times looking at old gameplay that has got long forgotten, like roguelikes, for instance, the rogue pattern of starting with a random setup and just exploring the game turned out to be a very popular thing, and have now become a genre again. But also to look at the ways that innovation halted, or innovation shouldn't have halted necessarily. So with platformers, maybe we shouldn't have halted innovation. We could have continued to use all the technology that we're developing to do other kinds of gameplay. Well, now as we move out of first-person shooter realms, or continue to have, say, the Battlefields and the Call of Duties, maybe there are still ways to innovate in first-person or even third-person that don't necessarily involve point and shoot, much like we saw with The Witness more recently, that it's a first-person game, it's a puzzle game, and uses a lot of camera tricks to solve the puzzles. Maybe there's more in that space to explore, even ways to combine these, and breakable worlds and physics simulation worlds, and so on, and all the parts that, of course, we've played with this semester. Where do we go next? How do we look at this and describe a vector that tells us what's the next big gameplay item? What's the next big innovation piece that we can look at? So, by way of sort of wrapping this up, I will show you some of the games that I consider some of my favorites of all times in terms of the types of innovation that they have done, and talk briefly about where they come from. So we see Silent Hill up at the top left here. It's especially Silent Hill 2, but is a game that, of course, it sort of follows the standard model of a third-person attack game in this case. However, most of the time you're kind of not meant to battle, right? A lot of the times you are running scared, and so it's really a terrifying game, difficult to see. Takes advantage of some of that in terms of the graphical content, but it also mixes gameplay and story in an incredibly detailed way, in that if you play the game where you're kind of battered and bruised, if you let the game kind of defeat you, then your character ends up getting an ending which describes him as being defeated as well. And it's kind of the game, the town of Silent Hill is a psychological test for this character, and your gameplay is, in a sense, is a psychological test. If, however, you do master the game, you keep yourself healed, you kind of don't let the game overwhelm you as a player, then your character also has an ending which is not overwhelmed as well. And so it's a great innovation. Just that by itself is a pretty cool innovation in terms of taking this kind of just generic 3D engine and the ability to fight monsters from a third-person camera versus a first-person camera, which is a nice innovation itself in terms of technology, but really taking the gameplay further. Portal takes that to another place in terms of the puzzles. It tells a pretty interesting story as well, especially the way that we sort of play games as a teaching tool, that all games sort of teach you how to use the mechanics. Portal makes that fairly explicit, and then turns it on its head and almost has you violate that in the middle. And again, I won't spoil that. I suggest you play it if you haven't. Certainly play it all the way to the end, and understand both the innovation in terms of the fact that we are in a first-person shooter type game, but now we are having to think differently about the way we're interacting with the world, because we're not really able to shoot at all, and instead we can only run and jump, and we could use the portal gun to set up holes in space and sort of indirectly impact the world in many ways. But very clever both in terms of the gameplay and the way the gameplay interacts with story there as well. Divinity Original Sin, or that series, and now they're also working on the Baldur's Gate 3 game, which is releasing soon, or is already released depending on when you're watching this video. And this is kind of the culmination of D&D as a computer game, right? So we see many of the games started with trying to create Dungeons and Dragons and we see kind of the ultimate example of it in Divinity, especially in terms of the way that you almost do get the ability to play a game like Dungeons and Dragons. You get to play with the rule set the way you would with Dungeons and Dragons. So a lot of what the excitement with a Dungeons and Dragons game is the way you can violate the rules. Nobody's just simply rolling dice over and over again to swing their sword over and over again, which is a lot of what the action RPG type games do, especially the ones that we've worked on this class. You just kind of keep swiping your sword. And really, the excitement with Dungeons and Dragons is kind of the creative ways you can play and interact and chat with people and so on. And so Divinity has really pushed the boundaries on that. I'm sure that there are ways to go further with AI and with mechanics and with multiple players playing the game to um, get more of that story, get more of that kind of gameplay out that happens with Dungeons and Dragons game. But certainly Divinity stands as kind of the state of the art, as a state of the art, and maybe Baldur's Gate 3 will now stand as the new state of the art in terms of taking it as a literal Dungeons and Dragons game. So it's built on the Dungeons and Dragons rule set explicitly, and so it carries that forward. And then finally, Brothers is one of those indie games where we're finally out of the platform element. We're kind of still seeing a platformy type game, but now we're seeing an innovation in not just the platformer aspects. So it's a 3D platformer, but the fact that you actually control two different characters with the same controller. So you actually use your left stick and your right stick to control each brother, and you almost end up thinking with two brains at once. And it's an innovation both in terms of the input system and the way you think about games at all. And so it's a very creative game in that sense. It kind of stands out. I'd love to see sort of games push in that direction more with innovative inputs. There's certainly games that exist like QWOP or QWOP, which try that kind of space. But Brothers is one that puts it together into a game that both has the grip of a story to carry it forward, as well as some really great narrative innovations as well. So all four of these games have some pretty great storytelling that mixes in with the gameplay. Divinity really follows the very standard Dungeons and Dragons practice in terms of the way the story mixes with the gameplay and the fact that you have combat and interesting combat. The other three innovate on the way we think of video games as they've gone, and Brothers especially. Again, there's something that could be spoiled, and I'll avoid doing that. But I'd highly recommend you check that one out as well for what it does to you as a player when you play Brothers and the way that impacts you over time and takes advantage of it. So these are some of the current games that then you have taken these technologies, taken the evolution of the gameplay, and have pushed it further. And some of these have actually started. Were coming out within the time frame that I said was it sort of the Dark Ages, but they still managed to exist. But they certainly stand out in my mind as pinnacles now, and I'm excited to see where the future would be if we continue to push the boundaries of this kind of innovation.